Hello, and thank you for joining us. This is No Soundbites Allowed, and I am your host, Michael Voss, the political dragon. I'm here with you today. It is February 23rd. It's approximately 2 in the afternoon, and I wanted to go over a hot button issue, an issue that is affecting everyone across America in one way or another. It's abortion, it's in vitro fertilization. It is about the future of children and unborn children. It's a big deal, and let's have a conversation a little bit about that. But before we get started, we do want to mention, if this is the first time that you're seeing our channel, we want to welcome you and thank you for being part of our audience. We want you to know that every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we do a live stream with you. We reach out across all of the world that the internet overlords will allow to hear what you have to say, because we believe in the First Amendment. We believe in your right to free speech. And we hope you will express that every Sunday with us. Now, we do long-form political commentary, and if it's the first time you're with us, I welcome you and thank you for being part of the audience. So when we look at these things, even though it is unscripted, we do try to go through all the details, and we try and give you as much data as possible so you can make up your mind. And I think that's most important today when we're talking about abortion. It is a huge issue, obviously. And everything that is related to children, birth, unborn children, it is a critical issue that has been gaining a lot of steam. And of course, in every election year, and 2024 is an election year, abortion is a critical issue for Democrats. They always bring this up. It is always one of their talking points to draw in their voters, their core supporters, to get them to be motivated, even if they wouldn't otherwise be motivated by an election. Thus, you always hear in an election year from Democrats that Republicans want to take away women's rights. They want to stop them from being able to have abortions. This is always the commentary. Whether you agree with that or not is kind of secondary to what we're going to be talking about today. But it is an issue we see, and I want to be very clear. This is a political issue. This is big news, more so than anything else, because it's an election year and Joe Biden has difficulty. He's losing. According to polling going back for the last 9 months, he is losing, and there is no major support, especially as we now have serious questions raised about his mental fitness and whether or not the 25th Amendment should be used against him. So this is a major distraction. And as important as it is, it's a major distraction from the mental fitness of Joe Biden, the issues with his international policy, the hostages being held by Hamas at this moment being sexually tortured and abused as we speak. This changes the conversation and gets the core Democrats, progressives, gets them the red meat to get them involved in this election where otherwise they would not be. That being said, let's take a look at what we're seeing here. Now, there's many sources on this, and you'll see the links in the description below, but we were looking at Reuters at this moment, came out February 23rd today. An explainer, Alabama's highest court ruled frozen embryos are people. So what is next? Now, let's understand this clearly. One of the key questions is IVF, in vitro fertilization. This is a very confusing subject to many people. One of the key questions is, obviously they take the eggs of a woman out of her body, they take sperm from a male out of their body, put them in a petri dish, and then once that egg is fertilized, they either freeze it or they introduce it to a woman's womb, and hopefully a baby will result. We know test tube babies exist. That is a reality now. We also know that in vitro fertilization does work. It has a low rate of success, but it does work. So we know these things are realities. This is a procedure, medical procedure, that does work for some people. But I think one of the key things about this is to remember that we are talking about fertilized eggs. It is critical to the conversation, especially with the ruling in Alabama, and we may see this in other states, that this is a fertilized egg. This isn't just an egg taken out of the body and stored, which also does happen. We know that, women will freeze their eggs, men will freeze their sperm. That happens. That's separate. They're not connected. There is no fertilization. That's a different issue, which I think is sometimes confused in this entire conversation. And I think that's very important to know the difference between those two states. Now, going back to what we see from Reuters, in their discussion of this, one of the most important things is there was an 8-1 majority decision from the Alabama Supreme Court based on an 1872 wrongful death of children statute, and also a statute from 2018, both of them addressing the rights of unborn children and children in general. Now, these are key terms. Unborn. I know the left doesn't like to say unborn. They like to say fetus. They like to say embryo. They like to use terms that dehumanize and disconnect individuals from life itself, the life of an egg, of a child. When does birth start? When does life start? Is it when the egg is fertilized, which many people believe, and yes, many religious people believe that, but scientifically, many scientists believe that is the moment of birth, that is conception, that is when life starts. Many will say the further left you go, the more likely it is for someone to say, well, no, personhood, life doesn't happen until the moment that person leaves the womb and is able to breathe air. Thus, the born or unborn status of that child. It's a very tricky issue, and it's a hot button, and a lot of people have emotions about this, no matter which way you look at it. But one of the things I notice in a lot of the coverage of this, whether you're talking about The Guardian, Vox, if you're talking about most of the left-leaning news media, they like to use the term unborn, and they like to use anti-abortion to describe pro-life viewpoints, and they're very specific in their wording, which I think is very indicative of their political beliefs invading this issue. And it's almost impossible to separate individuals' personal, religious, and political preferences in this discussion. It's almost impossible to remove. So we need to understand that. And that's one of the problems that many people had in this issue. You see, Chief Justice Tom Parker is the hot button of the hot button issue. His review, his statement on this case, he was one of the 8 who ruled on this and said that this was all about God. He was very religious in his opinion, supporting that the unborn child, even as an embryo, fertilized embryo, was life. He took the position of conception being the start of life, and therefore that is a person, and under the Constitution, under the laws of Alabama, that means that that embryo has both the rights of a person and also the protections of the state of Alabama. This is not a federal issue. Let me be very clear about that. And I think that's also worth pointing. This is not going to go to the Supreme Court. This is not a Supreme Court issue. This is a state issue. Very much so. Not just because the Supreme Court, in its ruling on Roe v. Wade and overturning that with Dobbs, they said this is a state's issue. But also looking at Alabama, looking at their legislature and the laws that they have passed, it is very specifically only dealing with in vitro fertilization in the state of Alabama. Let me take another step back. How did we get here? Very simply, there were three couples that had fertilized eggs that were frozen and being held. An individual entered into the facility where those eggs were being held and destroyed the eggs of those three couples. Those couples then sued. In that lawsuit, they also addressed the wrongful death of a child, of a minor, as part of their civil lawsuit. There is no criminal lawsuit. Because an individual was able to destroy their property, they're seeking repayment. And this is a civil matter. But because of the statutes of the law, they would receive more payment if it's also the wrongful death of a child. So it expanded the nature of the case, and so far they're winning. So the question isn't, were the embryos destroyed? Were they wrongfully destroyed? That is true. That is not in dispute. It's whether or not any of the medical facilities that held on to those embryos should be punished, and to what extent that they should be punished. That's what the case is honestly about. It has another life based on its politics far beyond that, but that's actually the case itself. How much money should these parents, these couples, receive for these embryos that were destroyed, their property that was destroyed? That's essentially the core question. Everything else is on top of that. Everything else expands far beyond that, because the true key question, I believe, that is being asked here is this life? And therefore, if it is life, under the Constitution and Alabama, must that life be protected? That's a very different question, which most of the news media isn't really addressing, at least not directly, at least in what I've been able to see from The Guardian, Vox, from a lot of the news media around the world. Now, let me come back again to, and I know it's unscripted, folks. This is a conversation. I want to hear your feedback. I'm looking forward to seeing it in your comments. But to go back to Chief Justice Tom Parker, I want to throw out that entire opinion. Yes, he has a religious-themed basis. He's invoking the Word of God and religion from his point of view, and using that perspective through Alabama law to try and cause a pro-life outcome. Let's discount that completely. And I'd say that because there is a separation of church and state. And our government is based on that religion is not inherent in the law. We don't quote Bible or the Talmud or the Quran or any religious tome in our laws. They are separate. You have any religion you want to have or not have in the United States. Our laws are based perhaps on some of the principles that are universally found in religion, but not the specific scripture of any religion. So, as an example, thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not murder is found in every religion known to man, I believe, at this time. You can't just murder people. That is religiously evil and wrong. And we have laws that say it is wrong to murder someone. That's not because of the religion. That's because of a society that agrees that if we didn't have that, there would be people who would randomly go around and kill people. I mean, they do it now. It may be even worse if there weren't penalty for doing so. So again, while we may be analogous to the religious thing, we're not quoting scripture to be able to enact that law. That's our laws on murder. I hope that's clear. So, again, with that said, I'm taking the position of Chief Justice Tom Parker and throwing it out. That still leaves the ruling with a 7-1 majority. 7 of the justices of the Alabama Supreme Court found in favor of the 3 couples that not only was it their property, but it was an unborn child that was killed, destroyed, whatever word you would like to use, were killed, and therefore the penalty is larger against these medical companies. So just throwing that out because, and again, Justice Parker wants to go the religious route. That's not part of our legal system. Throwing that out, it's still a 7-1 majority. We will get to, I will probably get to the actual dissenting opinion and talk about that in a little bit. And I will have links to everything I'm talking about so you can see it for yourself. But part of what made me decide to look at this today is to see what we're seeing in the YouGov polling. What are people responding to about this? So we know the basics of the case, and there are more details to this, but in the basics of the case, what are people saying about it in polling? Well, let's take a look. Today, just an hour or so ago, I took this poll, and this is frozen in time. I haven't updated it. At the time I took the poll, 298 other individuals were taking the poll. I have no idea how many in total have taken the poll, either at that time or since. Now, the poll starts off with, earlier this week, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that frozen embryos are considered children and that a person could be held liable for accidentally destroying them. The decision came from a wrongful death lawsuit brought by 3 couples whose embryos were lost at a fertility clinic. Okay, the key thing in this, and I think it's important, fertilized embryos. When people hear embryo, they don't think fertilized, they don't think baby, they don't think life. But it is important to understand that we are talking about, when we say a frozen embryo, we're not talking about an egg like you buy at the store. It's not frozen in that way. This was a fertilized sperm, fertilized this egg. This is a potential baby once it is thawed and introduced to a woman's womb or through a test tube. This is a potential life. It is fertilized. So it takes a different significance. And I think the poll by YouGov leaves out the term fertilized, and even though embryo would imply that, that's not common knowledge. That's not common wording. I think it's important to put that in to make that clear for everyone who takes the poll and sets their mind to understand the magnitude that is potentially being discussed here. Going on, they go, first of all, how much, if anything, have you read or heard about this Alabama Supreme Court ruling? 57% of the people taking the poll said they had heard a lot. Prior to me doing this video, I had heard some, but I didn't actually read the dissent. I hadn't read the ruling. I hadn't looked into several of the details that I now have for this video. So to be fair, I said a little. 57% say they have read a lot. Can't dispute that. I don't know. How familiar, if at all, are you with the process of in vitro fertilization? To be fair, I knew what it was. I knew how the procedure generally worked, but I wasn't very familiar with it. I think that's the same for most people. We know what it does. We know it's capable of providing either test tube babies or regular babies born out of a womb. We know that. We know it involves freezing eggs. Some of them are fertilized, some of them are unfertilized. We know that part. Very generally, I think that's the common knowledge on it, but this is, so I said somewhat familiar, and most people said the same, 54%. I think they have that general knowledge rather than anything more specific, although 39% said they are very familiar with it. Unclear what very familiar means. Generally speaking, in vitro fertilization involves retrieving a woman's eggs from her ovaries or using a donor egg, which is fertilized, to combine with a man's sperm in a laboratory. The fertilized egg is then transferred into the woman's uterus, where it can potentially create a pregnancy. I think it needs to be said more often that this is a fertilized egg from the beginning, to clarify at all points this is what we're talking about, because saying embryo isn't clear. When we say fetus, again, that is a term. These are terms meant to dehumanize and to separate the view of the average person from what the result is, what we are actually talking about. That's why you often hear the left, they love to call a baby a fetus. Even at 9 months, they call it a fetus, not a baby. Even as it's being born, they will refer to it as a fetus, not a baby, until the moment it is born, because it is a term of dehumanization. And when you say that you have aborted a fetus, that doesn't have the same impact as saying you've aborted a baby or that you killed a baby. It has a very different emotional impact and a very different result, because people conceptualize a baby in a very different way than they conceptualize a fetus. Going on. During the in vitro fertilization process, embryos may be frozen for various reasons, including banking, storage, genetic testing, or other medical reasons. Fair enough. Do you think that freezing embryos and storing them should or shouldn't be allowed? Now, this is a tricky question, because are we talking about, they start off with fertilized eggs. During the process, fertilized eggs may be frozen for a variety of reasons. Storage, fine, I can understand that. Genetic testing, a lot of people have a problem with genetic testing. It goes back to stem cells. A lot of people have a problem with stem cells. It's the same process. And that's some of the other medical reasons, to use the fertilized eggs to create stem cells, which could be then used for other medical purposes. Many people, religious and scientific, have a problem with that process. So it's very tricky because they're not being very clear what those purposes are. If you said embryos are being used so that they can make stem cells, so they would allow that life form to be grown either in a test tube or a woman's womb so that they could collect stem cells, killing that viable life and just collecting the stem cells to be used somewhere else. Well, that's farming human babies. That's farming life. That's something that's even worse than slavery. Most people would not agree with it if you said it in that way. But if you say it very vaguely, medical reasons, embryos are frozen, then it doesn't sound as significant or as life-threatening or potentially life-threatening. So that's why I don't like that wording. Again, this poll has been used very specifically. But most people, 91%, said it should be allowed. And I think under the term of banking and storage, the first item, the thing they want you to focus on, I think most people would agree with that. But if you said, well, it's being done because of collecting stem cells, I think you see that number drop significantly. The Alabama Supreme Court decision has raised confusion about the legality of some in vitro fertilization protocols under the new ruling. That's not really true. There is some confusion, and I think that's being created by the media and the left-leaning bias of the media and politicians. I don't think there's as much confusion as people would like to believe. It's pretty straightforward. These are fertilized eggs. Are they alive? The answer is yes. If they are alive, that means it represents a person, an unborn person. Under Alabama Constitution, according to the justices, an unborn person is, or a potentially unborn person, is life and therefore protected by Alabama and the Constitution. It's very straightforward. Not a lot of confusion there. If you destroy that, if you wantonly allow the destruction of those cells, of that IVF, then you're committing murder. You're allowing murder to happen, which is what happened in this case. Someone wantonly got access to the eggs and destroyed them. That's the problem. There's, again, not a lot of confusion in this if we look at the core of it. But the poll wants you to believe, and the news media wants you to believe, that this is confusing. It really isn't. Those who support the decision say embryos deserve greater legal protections, while those who oppose it say the ruling can raise questions about how clinics are allowed to use and store them. A couple clinics, I don't like the wording of that, a couple of clinics in the state have since stopped some IVF treatment steps while they assess how the ruling will impact their protocols. Well, let's think about this. They should. The IVF treatment facilities, these medical facilities, should be more secure. They should have more protocols to protect the property of individuals that have been entrusted to them. They're being paid to not only freeze, but to store those eggs, that property. If we're talking about unfertilized eggs, that's property. If it's a fertilized egg, that potential life, they have been entrusted with that. They have a contract for that. They should change their protocols to be able to better protect that, to prevent the arbitrary and wanton loss of that property and or life. There's nothing wrong with that. And so they should be changing their protocols. We would expect that. If you put money into a bank and that bank allowed someone to just walk in and take your money, you would want them to change their policies and to address and understand that they are liable because they allowed someone to take your money, because they didn't have protocols to protect you. It's the same concept that these IVF facilities have to go through. They have to protect the property they were trusted and paid to protect. This is not complicated. It's not complicated. The media wants you to think it's complicated. They word these things to make it sound complicated. It's not. But we'll get into that in a moment. And there is a question that if it is life, shouldn't there be even higher standards than just property? That's a question. So they go on to say, agree or disagree, frozen embryos should legally be considered children. That's difficult. Okay, again, when they say this, it's important. Frozen fertilized embryos, fertilized eggs are they children? Are they life? Now, 1 into 2, I don't see a distinction there, and I should make this clear. I do not see the distinction between saying life or a child or a baby. They're all the same thing. You can't be a baby and not have life. You can't be a child and not have life. Even if you are unborn, you have life. Otherwise, you're not a human being. You're not alive. So to say that, to try and have a distinction on that, I understand that the further left you go, the more they try and make that distinction, and thus they have the terms embryos and fetuses and anything and everything that would distract or disconnect the thought that this is life and this is a human being. They want to distract from that. I understand that's part of the abortion movement. They need you to be disconnected. I don't see that disconnection. So when I see frozen fertilized embryo, that means baby to me. You may have a different definition of that, but that is life. That's why the cells are dividing. That's why it will develop into what the left will call a fetus, I would call a baby. That's life. It's the moment of conception. Life has started. That's why those cells are dividing. That's why it grows and develops into a baby. You may disagree with that. That's my standpoint. Okay, so given that, are frozen fertilized eggs, frozen fertilized babies, are they children? I would say yes. But it's difficult. And I can understand why some people would say it's not. Because they're literally at the moment of conception. The eggs have divided a couple of times. They haven't really moved into the multicellular human being that we would expect. They're not even in the first stages of that, sometimes, depending on when they're frozen. So it is a fine line But if you take the position of conception is life, then the answer is yes. If you're saying conception is some point past that, then you would say no. I think most people are confused about that. And I think the wording of this is the reason why you see 79% say that they're not children. And the key words, they're children. If they said frozen fertilized eggs should be considered life, that is a different question. And that's actually the question that Alabama Supreme Court was looking at. Are they live? Are they alive? Are they unborn? And if you put in the words life, live, or unborn instead of children in this poll, I think you get a very different result. Because when people think of children, you think of some kid in kindergarten. You think of kids in a playground. You think of kids running around with clothing and maybe even babies, toddlers even. But you're not thinking of a pregnant woman. You're not thinking of the baby in utero, in the womb. You're not thinking of test tube babies. They've worded it very specifically because when you think children, you're thinking a small a human being, not a pregnant child, a baby in the womb. So this is unfair. I don't like the question. I think the question is meant to manipulate people, and whoever actually sponsored this poll knew that, and that's why they used the word children instead of life or unborn. Let's go on. So the poll goes on. And do you think Alabama's ruling will hinder people from getting in vitro fertilization treatment in the state or not? This is the part that really gets me. I really don't understand this because I've been seeing a lot of the left-leaning news media have been talking about how this is going to prevent women from having their right, how it's going to affect people's health care, which I don't agree with that, or their medical procedures. Well, let's be realistic here. And they're like, oh, I said, no, I don't think it will. And I'm in the minority. Only 15% say that. 80% said, well, yes, it's going to hinder people from getting IVF treatment. Why? Why would this stop that? If anything, it would ensure that if you have in vitro fertilization, that your eggs would be protected. It would be a guarantee that you will get the best treatment possible. Now, I see this and I think about it. So people are saying, oh, see, they're going to stop in vitro fertilization. No, this would encourage in vitro fertilization. It's a guarantee that if the services provided are substandard, that you get to sue. This is incentivizing the in vitro fertilization companies to have a higher standard and to have better treatment and services, not less. Now, will that be more expensive? Maybe. But then again, in vitro fertilization isn't cheap to start with. It is a very expensive, very intensive process in the first place. So we're not talking about, the baby mama down the block getting in vitro fertilization. It's not happening. This is something that only high-end individuals, high-end incomes are able to afford in the first place. So really, we're not talking about, and again, they word this in a way to make you think, well, Joe Average, the average couple in America, will be able to afford this. No, they're not. No, they're not. This costs tens of thousands of dollars. People don't have tens of thousands of dollars laying around in cash. This is not covered by most medical plans because it is, what do they call that? Discretionary. This isn't part of someone's livelihood. This isn't health care that will, Obamacare will not cover IVF, in vitro fertilization. Obamacare doesn't cover it because it's not essential for your life. This is discretionary. It's elective. And that means it's expensive. That's as simple as it gets. But 80% somehow think this will hinder people. I think they're wrong on that. I understand that's what the media is saying. I don't think that's actually the reality. Chief Justice Tom Parker, the justice who made the embryo ruling, stated he gave his religious beliefs on this. Now, why are they highlighting his opinion versus the other 7 opinions that do not rely on religion, but look at the state law of Alabama, the state constitution of Alabama, and they're interpreting that? Why do they focus only on Chief Justice Tom Parker? Because it's religious, because it is a religious ideology more likely, more closely aligned to Catholicism and to Christianity. And of course, Christianity is antithetical to the left, so therefore he is an easy target. Also, because it violates the separation of church and state, so he's an easy target. But that isn't the argument. His reasoning, again, throw out his position, and you still have a 7-1 decision, which is an overwhelming majority decision, saying that Alabama's constitution and laws make this clear. Throw his opinion out. It's meaningless. But going on, the poll using this to be able to try and manipulate those taking the poll, broadly speaking, do you think it was appropriate or inappropriate for Chief Justice Parker to mention religion in his ruling? It's completely inappropriate. 73% agree because of that separation of church and state. It is inappropriate. 16%, though, do believe that it is appropriate. 9% thought that it was appropriate, but he went too far. And honestly, with the separation of church and state, I think it's absolutely inappropriate. That doesn't change the other 7 opinions, Alabama's constitution, or the laws that were in the ruling. It's totally separate. The poll goes on to say, President Biden and 2024 presidential candidate Nikki Haley have both responded to the Alabama ruling. Biden called the decision outrageous and unacceptable. Why is it outrageous and unacceptable? That's the key thing. They're quoting Biden in part 3 words. What context is that? Again, this tells me this poll is, whoever commissioned this poll was from the left, and they're testing this. I think this was done by the Democratic Party or its agents to try and feel out how much of an issue this can be used in the 2024 election. Thus, they're talking about Biden and they're talking about Nikki Haley because they're seeing if this is an election issue. Will this motivate Democrats and progressives to go out and vote? That's why this is being targeted towards those individuals. Otherwise, why wouldn't you get a quote of what did Trump say? What have Republicans said? What has Mike Johnson or any of the senators and representatives from the state of Alabama, what have they said? They're not talking about that. I think that tells you who commissioned this and what its purpose is. It is meant to gauge whether this can be part of the abortion conversation for the 2024 election. This is part of fortifying the 2024 election to get more Democratic votes. I truly believe that. And that's why they only quote 3 words of what Biden said without giving proper context. All we know is he said this. What context, what are the details, we don't know. But they do give us more context and more of an understanding of Nikki Haley, someone who will not win the Republican primary. She has no chance in hell, but yet they want to focus on her statement. Why is that? It's unclear. And they give us an entire paragraph, more context on what she says. Haley said, embryos to me are babies. When you're talking about an embryo, you're talking about, to her, that's a life. And I do not, so I do see where that's coming from when they talk about that. Well, let's be very clear. So you have Joe Biden saying it's outrageous and unacceptable, which in the context of this paragraph seems to say he doesn't believe that a baby, an embryo, a fetus are life, that they're not human beings, and therefore do not have rights, and therefore can be destroyed like property. And Nikki Haley is saying, no, that is life, pro-life. She has a pro-life position, that they are life. Life is at conception, and therefore we can understand why the ruling came down as it did. Again, this is very political, and I think it's from the left. I could be wrong. I look forward to seeing your comments telling me what you think of that. Democrats have begun to campaign on the issue ahead of November's election. Again, this is political. How big of an issue do you think Alabama's frozen embryo ruling will be in the 2024 election and campaign season? I think this is the reason. This is the entire purpose of this poll. It is meant to answer this question alone. No other part of this is important. This is what they wanted to see. The Democrats want to see if they can include this poll, these questions, this issue, worded in this manner as part of their push to fortify 2024, to re-elect Joe Biden, and to elect Democrats across the nation. That's what they're looking at. Will it be an issue? The answer, I believe, is somewhat of an issue because it is a hot button, because they're trying to include this into abortion. And abortion is always a hot button, and it is always in an election. And it will, again, in 2024, it will be a major rally call because there is nothing else the Democrats have. They have the race card, they have gender issues, they have abortion. That is basically it. They can't talk about the economy. It has failed. They can't talk about international policy because that has failed. They don't want to talk about the 30,000 Americans that have been abandoned under the Biden administration. They don't want to talk about the hostages being tortured by Hamas as we speak. They don't want to talk about the growing tensions, not just in the Ukraine, not just in the Middle East, but also in Southeast Asia with China. They don't want to talk about anything of these issues, and they have nothing to point to. There is no success to date. So they have to talk about their hot button emotional issues to try and motivate people. Let me go on. But overwhelmingly, some 80% of people who are taking this poll believe that this question agree that this will be part of the 2024 election, and I think that's important. And then they go on to, if you or your partner were unable to conceive naturally and wanted a child, would you consider IVF, in vitro fertilization? No. For me, the answer is no. For 74% taking this poll, they said yes, they would. I don't know that that's actually true. First of all, it's out of the financial capabilities of overwhelmingly, I'd say about 80% of the population cannot afford this process in the first place. It's not a reality. And then you're looking at those who can afford it. I don't know that it's not that popular. It's not that popular procedure. People don't generally want to use this. So I think that's important. But I think really, again, the most important thing about this poll is this question right here. How big of an issue do you think this will be in the 2024 election? Because Democrats are campaigning on it. This is what they think will help them win the 2024 election. Okay, so we've gone through the poll. We've gone through some of the elements of the case. And I think that's kind of important to understand those things. But I said, why aren't in the polling and in some of the reporting, why aren't they referring back to the state itself, the politicians of that state, the people of that state? Because they don't get the answer that they want. I'll show you what I mean. So we take a look, and this is from the Associated Press. And in the Associated Press, the article, What's Next After Alabama's Ruling That Counts IVF Embryos as Children. And so they do sum up what we've been talking about so far and what the ruling has said. And did they grant, one of the key questions, did the court grant personhood to embryos? Well, according to the Constitution of Alabama and its laws, they didn't grant personhood. It already existed. Although, again, and even in the documents from the court itself, they weren't talking about personhood. They did not define that, but they did understand that this is life. And because it is life, it has certain protections under the law. That's it. That doesn't denote personhood. Personhood already existed. Let me try and explain that in a different way, maybe. And this is where they try and make it all confused. Like the court has done something that well beyond their ability. No. It's like the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't grant American citizens rights. Other countries have laws that grant them rights. In England, you are granted the right to speak under the law, to say things that are approved as opposed to things that are unapproved. In Canada, you have an approved language. They don't have freedom of speech. In the United States, you are born with the right to speak freely. It isn't a right given by the Constitution. It is a right recognized by the Constitution that the government cannot impede, that they cannot take away from you. It is a God-given birthright. That's what our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence declare. That is their purpose. We already have these rights, and we're just exercising them. And the Constitution and laws are meant to limit how the government affects these rights we already have. It's the same thing in terms of the embryos, I believe. And according to Alabama and the ruling by the Alabama Supreme Court, those at birth, at conception, those rights exist. And the purpose of government, the first and primary purpose of government, is to protect the people from anything they cannot protect themselves from. There's a war. A nation wants to attack us. Terrorists want to attack us. It is the purpose of the government to protect you. That's their job. And children, more so than adults, the government is absolutely obligated to protect children, even ahead of adults, because they are not capable of defending themselves. That would be children, that goes to babies, that means the unborn, and in this case it extends to embryos or fertilized eggs. It is the purpose of the government to protect them at its primary focus. So they didn't grant personhood, as is being alleged by the AP. Now, I know that there may be others that would disagree with that. Mary Ziegler, who's at the University of California, says that Alabama didn't go that far. It didn't say that embryos have the same rights as people. And she goes to qualify that as not yet. Well, that's not what their purpose was. So she's incorrect in saying that. And again, what they said in the ruling was very clear. They weren't trying to make that decision. Going on, are lawmakers considering actions in response to the ruling? Well, Senator Tim Melson, a Republican state Senator Tim Melson, has said that he's going to try and protect the in vitro fertilization services in the state, because many of them have shut down, trying to figure out how they need to improve their services, since they are going to be held liable for wantonly destroying life. That's important. Not only destroying property, but wantonly destroying life. So they are going through the process of figuring out, well, how do we do this? Do we change some of the wording in our contract? Do we change and in changing the wording, also changing some of the services we provide, which may or may not entail some of the costs as well? Do we have to worry about being sued? Okay, this is a business, and he's worried about protecting that business. And the court, I think, should be more concerned, and he should be more concerned about protecting life. He goes on to say that a fertilized egg has legal protections under the statute after it is implanted in the uterus, not before. Now, that's a point of contention. That's a point of contention, and that's what this case brings up. Is it only after the egg, the fertilized egg, is put into a womb, is it then life? Or is it already life? And I would say it's already life. You may disagree. You may have a different opinion. But since the egg can be grown in a test tube, and and the result is life, then it is life inherent in itself, whether it's in the uterus or anywhere else. The cells are dividing. The fertilized egg is growing, so it is life unto itself. It is not required to be in a uterus or in a test tube to make that happen. It is already happening. So I have a difference with State Senator Tim Nelson on that. He goes on to say, and I quote, "I'm just trying to come up with a solution for the in vitro fertilization industry and protect the doctors and still make it available for people who have fertility issues that need to be addressed because they want to have a family." So he's trying to find something in the middle of the road. He's trying to promote business in his state without denying people's rights. Fair enough. He said the ruling is an unintended consequence of the language that lawmakers and voters added to the Alabama Constitution, saying it is state policy to recognize the rights of the unborn. Well, yes, because politicians aren't thinking through what they are doing. They're so busy trying to do something, quote unquote, to do something that they aren't thinking about the consequences of what they are doing. I'm not against them protecting the unborn. I think it's correct. I think that's what the Constitution and our amendments have said. That is one of the basis of why governments exist. I have no problem with that. I disagree with people on how they compartmentalize the different stages of birth, because if you don't have a fertilized egg, you will never have a baby. You will never have a human being. No one can be born. I think it's just logical and it's scientific, but there is contention on that. Fair enough. So we do need to address that, and that is something that needs to be addressed. Going to The Guardian, one of the things I found very interesting in their article, and when they were quoting Tommy Tuberville, who is a Republican U.S. Senator for Alabama. And in their article, which came out today at 10 a.m., he's troubled. And he says, this is a very difficult conversation. I believe he said, asked at a conservative conference on Thursday what he would say to women currently denied fertility treatment. The former college football coach, why is that important? Why is it important that Tommy Tuberville used to be a football coach? He is a senator, regardless of anything else. You do not need an Ivy League degree. You don't need to be a scientist, and you damn sure don't need to be a lawyer to be a member of elected office. So the fact that he was a football coach is meaningless. That doesn't convey whether he is intelligent or not intelligent, whether he is capable or incapable, or whether he is knowledgeable about the issue or not. That is simply put in there, stating that he is a former college football coach to discredit him and to try and negatively portray and characterize anything he might say. This is character assassination by The Guardian in putting that in, because it is unnecessary. He is a U.S. state senator, full stop. Doesn't matter what he did before when it doesn't apply in this situation. They go on to say, yeah, I was all for it. We need to have more kids. We need to have an opportunity to do that, and I thought this was the right thing to do. What's the problem? He supports life. He is pro-life. He supports being able to protect an embryo when it is entrusted to a business that they need to lift their standards. This is not confusing. The Guardian goes on to say, but then he was pressed on whether the ruling would negatively affect people who are trying to have conceive. I think they meant conception. Tuberville said, quote, well, that's for another conversation. I think the big thing is right now, you protect. You go back to the situation and try to work out to where it's best for everybody. I mean, that's what the whole abortion issue is about. And he is correct. And I don't see a problem with that. But again, this is something that The Guardian is trying to use to say that there is confusion or that this is somehow unclear and that its consequences are not accounted for. Well, that's not really the case. It is very clear. I think it's been very clear all throughout what I have been talking about in detail. It's the fact that the news media are trying to shrink this down to a 30-second soundbite. They're trying to minimize this and package it so that it will be attractive to Democrats and to help motivate them and fortify the 2024 election. And in trying to do that, they introduce confusion into the subject where it otherwise does not exist. And they're trying to add in other elements to try and convince people that this is not only confusing, but that it is a bad decision. And I think that's wrong. And I think you can see that in what they're talking about here. So they go on in The Guardian, they go on to say, with the ruling by the Alabama Supreme Court, Republican anti-abortion politicians, why are they saying that? Anti-abortion? No, that would be pro-life. That's the position. It's called pro-life, not anti-abortion. It's called pro-life. They're saying it as if abortion is the standard. Abortion is the norm. That's the accepted term. That's what you would normally be. That would be the normal position. It isn't. Life is the normal position. Giving birth is the normal process. The interruption in that normal process of becoming impregnated, being pregnant, and then bearing the child, the interruption of that is abortion. That is not natural. That is the interruption in that cycle. And therefore, abortion is the outlier, not the norm. So Republicans aren't anti-abortion, they're pro-life. But again, the wording is important because The Guardian, left-leaning as it is, wants to support the progressive ideology. They want to support more abortion, not less abortion. And therefore, they have to word it as if it is the norm and as if it is a positive, natural outcome when it isn't. That's why they don't want to mention pro-life, because you don't get the same message in your mind. In addition, when they say anti-abortion, that is confusing to you. Anti-killing babies. You don't think that way. That's what it means, but they want to word it in a way so it's confusing. It's clunky. It doesn't flow well, and they want that to unnerve you and make you think that this is not quite right. So that's why they chose the wording here instead of saying pro-life, saying it's anti-abortion politicians. And again, abortion is the left. So Republicans are not in favor of the left. You shouldn't vote for them because they're against abortion. Well, they're in favor of pro-life. That's a very positive statement. The Guardian wants the negative. Going on. Republican anti-abortion politicians are now in a bind between opposing abortion and supporting treatments that promote conception. No, they're not. Think about that. Pro-life politicians are saying that the in vitro fertilization process should safeguard the living embryos that they have under their control. That's a pro-life statement. That's not confusing. There's no confusion there. In supporting and agreeing with the Alabama Supreme Court, you're agreeing with protecting life, the life that has been entrusted to these IVF facilities. You're not trying to abort them. You're trying to protect them. There is no confusion here. You can be against abortion, which would be in favor of leaving the IVF companies as they are, the in vitro fertilization companies, saying that someone wantonly entering your facility and just destroying other people's property and embryos and fertilized eggs, that's to allow that would be the norm. That would be the pro-abortion point of view. That would end lives artificially, as opposed to saying, no, I want to protect those embryos. I want to protect that life as much as possible. And I want to enforce that on these companies, that they have that standard to reach, that the bar is higher than they are currently, and they need to raise themselves up to that higher standard. That is a pro-life position. There is no confusion. There is no bind. And they know that this is a weak statement. The Guardian knows, the editor knew that this was weak and not supported. So they threw it at the end of the article and they threw it into a single statement and moved on because it is weak and it is singularly there to try and manipulate the reader to take on a more progressive, pro-abortion point of view. And I think that's insulting. I think it needs to be called out. Even looking at what we see here from the Vox, where they say the Alabama Supreme Court opinion holding that embryos are children explained. Did Alabama Supreme Court just ban IVF treatments? No, they didn't. It's stupid to even say that. They said this on February 20th. It is a dumb conclusion, but they are trying to put fear into the minds of women and couples and to the American public, trying to say that the court just stopped a medical procedure. No, they didn't. They said the bar is raised, that the companies, the IVF treatments, must be protected as at a higher standard than they are right now. That's what they have literally said. Again, let's go back for a second and remember, what was the purpose of this case? Someone destroyed, wantonly accessed and destroyed property, fertilized eggs of 3 couples, and they wanted to sue. They wanted to be remunerated for their loss. That's what this case is about. And all the Supreme Court has said is that the severity of the loss was magnified because these were living beings that were killed, that these were human beings that were killed, that they had rights that were taken away. And so that the penalty is higher than what it would otherwise have been if it were just property. That's the underlying case. So when we get to hear things from Vox saying they banned treatments, no, they didn't. They never even considered anything about the treatments. It isn't about the treatment. It's about protecting the property, if you want to take it from a progressive point of view, or protecting the lives, if you look at it from any other view other than the progressive left. That's what it's about. Life, protecting life. It has nothing to do with the treatment. If you can afford the treatment, you can still get the treatment. No one has stopped you from doing that. No, nor has it prevented IVF, in vitro fertilization efforts, to exist in the state of Alabama. No one has stopped it. They just said, make sure you're doing a better job to protect life. That's it. And they also did not say that embryos are children. And that's the exaggeration of Vox. Why? Because they want you to think if you said babies are children, the American people would say, yeah, babies are children. And children are babies. You can say that. And everyone would agree. And if you said, well, a pregnant woman, that unborn baby, that's a child. And when people visualize that, and most people would visualize a baby in the 8th, 9th month, a baby about to be born, and you'll say, yeah, well, that baby is a child. Unborn, but still, it's a child. But when you say embryo, again, we dehumanize that same baby. That's just an earlier stage of that same baby. It's still alive. But because you're using the term embryo or fetus, now you're dehumanizing it and you're disconnecting that humanity that is inherently there. And when you say embryos are children, people aren't thinking a baby. They're not thinking an unborn baby. They're thinking an egg. And that's why they use that term. Again, this is how they manipulate you. This is how they are trying to fortify the 2024 election to try and get you outraged and enraged to think, oh my God, they're taking eggs and they're saying eggs are kids. Well, no, fertilized eggs are children because that's life. That's true. But, an egg isn't a child. There's a difference. So Ian Millhiser is being very dishonest, or at least whoever wrote the title and the subtitle, they're being dishonest here, and they know it. So they go into the case and they say, one of the things I found of interesting, and by the way, the actual Alabama Supreme Court case. It's called Burdick versus Asenye Burdick Asenye versus Center for Reproductive Medicine. So we can look at that, and we will in just a moment, to actually see the court decision. Notice very few of these articles, whether you're looking at the AP or Reuters or The Guardian, most of the media companies out there do not want to tell you what the actual title of this case is. They don't want you to read the actual decision. They want you to read their interpretation of the decision, an interpretation that leads to misquoting and misrepresenting the underlying facts and the issues at hand, as we see Vox doing with its title, knowing that the majority of people will not read their article. They'll only read the headline and make up their mind based on that headline. So they will put their misrepresentation up front so that people do not understand what's really going on. And since they don't normally get the access, the title and ability to access the actual decision, well, then they have nothing else to go by. But Vox does say, if it is illegal to destroy an embryo, again, a life, a living human being in its earliest stages, then it is unclear if in vitro fertilization can happen. Well, no, because that's not what the court case is about. That sentence is wrong. That has nothing to do with the actual case at hand. It wasn't that the embryo was destroyed. The embryo was wantonly and recklessly destroyed. That someone was able to steal the property and destroy the property, if you want to use it the left's terms alone, to take the babies, those life forms, and to destroy them arbitrarily. So it's not destroy the embryo, it's arbitrarily destroy the embryo without purpose, without cause, without authorization. And when you add those words in, cause, authorization, reckless, when you add those terms into the situation, which are the terms of the court case, it changes your understanding of it. And Vox knows this. The editor, the writer know this, which is why they are misrepresenting it, saying, well, if it's illegal to destroy an embryo, that's not what Alabama was deciding. That's not what the case was in front of the Alabama Supreme Court. That's not the case that you and I are talking about. And they know it. So when they say it's unclear if IVF can happen, they're saying this to try and confuse you on where you should stand on this issue. They're trying to demonize any Republicans or anyone who is pro-life who would support what has been decided. They're trying to get the people of Alabama to vote against their own best interest, the support of the government, and the government doing its job, which is to protect children, to protect the defenseless, those who are least capable of being able to defend themselves. This is what Vox is trying to do. This is what the writer and the editor are doing here, is trying to misrepresent this. They go on to say, and if it happens, medical facilities may have to pay outlandish costs to store frozen embryos, earliest stages of human life, long after it is clear that no one will ever use them. That's potentially something that may happen. Again, that depends on the contract that is entered into. That depends on the couples or the individuals who are putting those fertilized eggs into their care. What did they agree to? Did they understand the terms? What does the contract say? What is the facility meant to do? That is not established. That is not a final fact. They're just putting it together like that, so you're supposed to think that it is. So they're, again, trying to manipulate you, because that's not what was in the decision. That's not necessarily a consequence of what has been decided. They're trying to manipulate you. It's really insulting when we see that. And when I say these things, I want you to understand, this is the case view. You can go to the Alabama Appellate Courts, to their public portal, which we will have the link in the description. And I advise you, take a look at it. Because when you look at the ruling, I'm looking at pages 81 out of 131. This is from the dissent, which starts on, where is it here? This is the dissent of Justice Cook, as I recall. Yeah. So Justice Cook's dissent. This is the only justice who said, I do not agree. So again, throwing out the religious ideology and just looking at the 7-1, this is the one dissent. And looking at this, his answer is, well, the courts in 1872 did not understand in vitro fertilization, and therefore in vitro fertilization does not apply to the current day. Taking that law from 1872 to today, it does not apply. And this is part of why they dissent, because the definition of person, he doesn't believe applies here. That this is in vitro fertilization isn't part of the process of a life, a person, a child. And that's his argument about that. Now going to 82. In page 82, I believe it is, no, here it is. It is at the bottom of page 81. The defendants nevertheless present a catch-22 argument in support of the dismissal of those claims. On the one hand, they allege that the plaintiff's wrongful death claims were properly dismissed because their frozen embryos are not, quote, minor children, end quote, under the Wrongful Death Act. On the other hand, they allege that the trial court properly dismissed the plaintiff's negligence and wantonness claims because their frozen embryos each represent, quote, a life, end quote. I am deeply troubled by this argument and the consequences that could result from adopting this position. However, as explained below, there is no need for the court to reach this catch-22 argument at this time because it is simply too soon to dismiss the claims under Alabama's liberal pleading rules. It's for this reason that I would reverse the trial court's dismissal of the plaintiff's negligence and wantonness claim. Now you can see this for yourself. The argument that is being made by the dissenting point of view is the court can't figure it out. That's it. He's confused. He doesn't know where life starts. He doesn't know if the Constitution of Alabama, if the laws of Alabama include a baby that is not born. He's unclear. Because if it does include a baby that is unborn, then it must also convey that same right and privilege to an embryo. The question isn't if it's life, then it is life, period. And he is unclear about that. And so that's why it's catch-22. Because the arguments are it's life and it's not life. And that's what's being presented to them. And that's where the decision in the courts or the argument in the courts were unclear and unfair. But I will have the link so you can read all of the opinions of all of the judges, all 8 of them, including the dissent, which there is only one. And you can come to your own decision on that. And yes, it is written like lawyers for other lawyers. So have a thesaurus ready, have a dictionary next to you, and read it anyway. Look up the terms that don't make sense to you. If there's a legal terminology, go and look it up either online or in the dictionary or the thesaurus and understand it for yourself. Don't rely on me or, God forbid, Vox to tell you what they think because they're not giving you the honest answer. I'm telling you from the front, I am a conservative Republican. I have a bias. I started this telling you what I believe where life begins, what conception. I said that. I started so you understand my position, but you also understand the core elements of the case and what was being decided. We started with that first so you understood clearly what the decision impacts and what this is really about. Because what it is becoming about, and we see that in the poll, we see that in the reporting, we see that they are trying to fortify the 2024 election. They are trying to manipulate you, to confuse you, to try and get votes. That's all this is really about. It's not about protecting property, which at its core, that's what this case is about. It's not about protecting life, which at its core, this case addresses. No. At the purpose that we're seeing from the left in the left-leaning media is, aren't you angry? Vote Democrat. Republicans are bad. Vote Democrat. You don't need to understand why. Vote Democrat. And abortion is good. Abortion is good, and you have to vote Democrat. That's what their focus is. And I think that's insulting. Now, I have gone deep dive into this. We've spent an hour and 15 minutes trying to look at this from the dissent, from the reporting, from the polling, from the key elements that we have seen throughout all of this. And I've been very clear on where my position is. You may or may not agree. I hope it was clear. We are always unscripted when we address these issues. So this is how I was thinking through it as I looked at the various media. You may or may not agree. But tell me, in the comments, where do you stand? How do you feel about this? Do you think that the YouGov poll was fair, or was it misleading on purpose? Do you think Vox and The Guardian were trying to mislead you on purpose, using language and terminology and structure to try and guide you to a certain outcome? In other words, fortify your view on this issue and hopefully the 2024 election. Do you think I'm wrong, or do you think I've missed it? I look forward to hearing what you have to say about all of this. And we remind you again, please do join us this Sunday and every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our live stream with you talking about this and many other issues. I thank you, and I hope that you're going to have a great day.